So as promised in the previous module, we'll now closely examine the structural classifications of joints, and we'll begin with the fibrous joints. So at fibrous joints, adjacent bones are directly connected to each other by a fibrous connective tissue. Now notice in this joint type that there is no joint cavity. The fibers that make up the fibrous joints are composed of collagen. And the gap between the bones could be very narrow and contain very short fibers, or the gap could be wide and would contain much longer fibers. In fibrous joints with a narrow gap, these are classified functionally as synarthroses because these short fibers that unite those two bones permit basically no movement at that particular joint, while the fibrous joints with much wider gaps between the bones are classified as amphiarthroses because the collagen fibers are much longer and they permit some movement at that particular joint. So we'll see three types of fibrous joints. We'll see sutures, syndesmoses, and gomphoses. So although these three joints have different names, they have all the same basic structure that we've reviewed on the previous slide. They really only differ in their locations within the body. So let's look at sutures first. So sutures in this diagram are on the left side here. These are the sutures are the narrow fibrous joints that are found between most of the bones of the skull. These are strong joints that tightly bind the skull bones together for the function of protecting the brain underneath the skull bones here. The fibers tend to be very short and permit really no movement at that particular joint. So therefore these are functionally classified as synarthroses. So these are immovable joints that have the function of very tightly binding the skull bones together so that they can protect the brain underneath, or the brain that is deep to those skull bones. So moving on here, looking at the middle of this diagram, we have the syndesmosis joints. These are fibrous joints in which the bones are much more widely separated from one another in terms of their physical distance, but are generally held together by a narrow band of collagen fibers that's called a ligament, or they could be held together by a wide sheet or a broad sheet of collagen fibers that's called an interosseous membrane. So I'll show you that in the next slide coming up here. Because these syndesmoses joints do allow some movement between the joints, the syndesmoses are functionally classified as amphiarthroses, so they do permit much more movement at the syndesmosis joints than the suture joints do. So any kind of torn syndesmosis type of joint, either a torn ligament or a torn interosseous membrane, is usually referred to clinically as a sprain. So that's when we have an overstretched ligament, or in some cases a ligament that is torn away from either other pieces of the ligament or the bone itself. So looking a little bit more at that interosseous membrane, we see that there are a couple places in the body where interosseous membranes exist. And these are basically wide or broad ligaments that unite bones that are parallel to one another. Particularly long bones in the forearm and in the leg are where we see interosseous membranes. This example here just happens to be in the forearm. There's a gap between the shaft of the radius, which is the lateral bone of the forearm, and the ulna, which is the medial bone of the forearm. And between them, in that gap between them, they are joined or united by a broad ligament that's called an interosseous membrane. The membrane helps to keep these two bones aligned, but not completely immobilized. So this particular joint allows for the radius to rotate over the ulna during forearm rotation. The membrane also provides a surface for the many muscles that are located in the forearm as a site of muscle attachment. So the membrane itself serves as a muscle attachment point for skeletal muscles within the forearm. And last but not least, returning to that diagram of our fibrous joints, we see on the right side here a gomphosis. And a gomphosis is a specialized fibrous joint that anchors the root of a tooth into its bony socket on either the upper jaw or the lower jaw of the skull. And the gomphosis is composed of these small ligaments called periodontal ligaments that help to secure the tooth to the jawbone. Now, the strength of the gomphosis joint permits no movement of the tooth in the socket, so it's very similar to the very short fibers that we see in the suture joints here. And so for that reason, the gomphosis joints are functionally classified as synarthroses. So these are immovable joints.